I'm innocent. I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Pawpaw.
Declarations of love and words of support from strangers for now convicted double murderer Alec Murdaugh. What makes someone write to someone they've never met? Thanks for joining us for Law and Crime's Sidebar podcast. I'm Angenette Levy. Alec Murdaugh is in a maximum security prison in South Carolina following his sentencing for the murders of his wife Maggie and son Paul. Murdaugh has a prison-issued tablet that contains educational materials and a messaging system that allows anyone who signs up to send him a message. And many people have sent messages to Alec Murdaugh. FITSNews in South Carolina obtained some of the messages through a Freedom of Information Act request. One message from a woman named Nicolette K stated, "I think I love you. I think about you all day, every day." Lacey K wrote, "You don't know me and I don't know you, and I hope this does not come off as weird that I am reaching out to you. I apologize if it does. I'm unable to get you off of my mind." Women sent most of the messages to Alec Murdaugh, some just offering words of support and a sympathetic ear. A man wrote and asked Murdaugh how he was adjusting to life behind bars. And a Netflix documentary producer also wrote to Alec Murdaugh, offering him an enormous platform to share his story. I spoke with Will Folks from FITSNews about all of this. His researcher, Jen Wood, actually obtained these messages. What was your reaction when you first looked at the messages from the various women to Alec Murdaugh?
Well, I came up in the 1980s, and for me, it kind of took me back to, there's a Jane's Addiction song about Ted Bundy, Nothing Shocking. And that sort of was where my mind first went. And then you think about, I don't know if we've got any fans of the Smiths out there, but their song, about writing to the hero imprisoned. And so a lot of people put these killers on a pedestal. There's a clinical term for it, I think, hybristophilia. This attraction to these famous killers. I don't understand it. Certainly it's a commentary on our society. And I think some would even say perhaps it's a commentary on those who are in our business. And I think that's one of the things that's challenging in situations like this. When you cover stories like this, it's news, obviously. You have to report on it, but also it's important, I think, and what we try to do is to balance it with the stories of the victims and survivors of crime, as well as that process of obtaining justice for them. But for me, it definitely took me back to some of those. I remembered some of those songs in my head about folks who are just obsessed with killers and establishing relationships with them. It's just one of these weird things.
These records do not show that Alec Murdaugh responded to any of the people who sent messages to him. And notably, not one of his family members has sent a message to him through this tablet. So what prompts someone, a perfect stranger, particularly women, to message an inmate that they've never met?
Yeah, Angenette, this is such an interesting phenomenon that we're describing here. And I want to start off by saying that it's very unlikely that there is an underlying psychopathology. What I mean by that is that it's unlikely that there's a mental disorder associated with this. However, some research into this, and it's very limited and it's very small in scope, seems to suggest that the women in particular tend to have abuse backgrounds. So whether it's prior marriages or romantic relationships that were abusive, or they were abused, by their primary caregivers or something like that, either way, the notion of love and romantic relationships has warped for these individuals. And so they're more than willing to engage in nurturing kinds of behaviors, even though they know the individual that they are nurturing and caring for and offering these statements of support have committed, in particular, violent acts. So I think it's such an interesting concept of how the empathic part of humanity can come across and maybe even sort of turned on its head a little bit.
Hybristophilia is a term that's out there. It's called, I guess, prison groupie syndrome. Do you see some of this being hybristophilia, this classification?
Yeah, hybristophilia is it's a unique concept when it comes to paraphilias, and it's important to distinguish a paraphilia, which is just sexually deviant behavior. And by deviant, I just mean something that's outside of society's norm, versus a paraphilic disorder. Now, this is someone who has an actual mental disorder in which the sexual component has become a real problem and is interfering with the person's day-to-day life, perhaps even boundary crossing, though not always. When we look at hybristophilia, generally speaking, we're seeing individuals who get sexual gratification through a connection with someone who is engaged in a serious boundary violation, rape, potentially murder, sadism, these kinds of things in which boundary crossing is a major component. That's where hybristophilia kind of comes from. Is it possible that some of the women, even potentially men who are interacting with inmates, are having sexual gratification simply from the cross communication that's happening? Sure, but those messages would be very specific when it comes to the sexual connotation. Just on its surface, offering support or even saying things like "I love you" and stuff like that, that's not hybristophilia.
Alec Murdaugh did not make any phone calls for most of the month of March. In fact, after he'd been in prison for about a week, I contacted the Department of Corrections and asked whether or not he'd made any phone calls. I was told he had not. Then on March 23rd, the records indicate that Alec Murdaugh tried to place 5 collect calls. Some were not accepted, others were not allowed.
And so we thought it was very surprising that he had not made or even really attempted to make any calls. And sure enough, when we got the logs back, you don't see those calls until the very end of March, the 23rd rather, is when he started making some of those calls or attempting to make those calls. And all of this is done, by the way, on these tablets. Every inmate in the South Carolina Department of Corrections receives a prison issued tablet. It is vendor based. They've got educational software on there. They can certainly work on their legal appeals if that's what they want to do. And there is limited messaging and phone capability on that tablet. Of course, it's all heavily monitored, heavily regulated. And so inmates who abuse that privilege, can find their access to programs and apps on this tablet restricted, or they could wind up having it taken away completely, from what I'm told. But it was incredibly interesting to look at that activity because, like you said, there's a lot of incoming, just not any outgoing from Alec Murdaugh. So again, I don't know whether or not he's aware that his communications will be monitored and he wants to be very careful what he says. But it's going to be very interesting to follow in subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests whether or not he starts engaging some of these people.
Alec Murdaugh will serve his sentence in protective custody until further notice. The prison where he is being housed is not being disclosed for security reasons. And that's it for this edition of Law and Crime Sidebar podcast. You can listen to and download Sidebar on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And of course, you can always watch it on Law and Crime's YouTube channel. I'm Angenette Levy, and we will see you next time.